Hi, my name is Duncan Ryūken Williams, and I'm honored today to join you for the 2020 Tadaima virtual pilgrimage. I'm going to be presenting to you today a talk titled A Pilgrimage to Remember. It's about the journey I've undertaken to become a Japanese American. I was born in Tokyo, Japan, to a Japanese mother and a British father. And I landed in the United States for the first time when I was 17 years old. So I guess I could start the story there. That's about 33 years ago. But I think it'd be more accurate for me to start the story around 18 years ago. That's when I came across a document, the one that you see on your screen on the left, a diary by a Buddhist priest called Reverend Shinjo Nagatomi. Now, at that time, I had just finished my PhD in Buddhist studies. That was my major back in graduate school, under the guidance of Professor Masatoshi Nagatomi. He had been Harvard University's first professor of Buddhist studies, hired in 1957. And I was one of his very last students working with him in the 1990s and finishing up in about 2000. It was just after I had submitted my doctoral dissertation and was pursuing a career in that area that I heard the unfortunate news that my professor had suddenly passed away. And in the process of helping his family with settling his affairs and cleaning up his office, they asked me also to officiate a memorial service for him because I, in addition to being a scholar of Buddhism, happened to be ordained as a Buddhist priest. In that process of helping the family, I was looking through his papers, books, manuscripts, letters, in his ever messy office at the Harvard Yenching Library building. And in looking through that, I came across these documents. It was a series of, as you can see, these yellowed pieces of paper. It had the name Nagatomi on it, but I could tell from the handwriting it wasn't his. And I would come to learn in reading it and trying to translate portions of it, that it was written by his father, a Buddhist priest, Reverend Shinjo Nagatomi, in a place called Manzanar. I have to admit, at that time, I didn't really know very much about Manzanar or any of the other incarceration sites of World War II. And as I took these, what I thought were very valuable family heirlooms to my professor's now widowed wife, she asked me to translate portions of her father-in-law's diaries from Manzanar. And that's when I learned that I didn't know what a mess hall was or a barracks were, these words in Japanese. As I was trying to translate it into English, I knew I had to learn more about what it meant to have been Japanese American back in World War II. And slowly, as I began translating this diary, not because I wanted to become a scholar of Japanese American history or anything like that, but as a favor to the family that I was very indebted to, I would come to learn my professor's wife's story as well. She was only 11 at the time of Pearl Harbor, and she lived with her parents who came from Wakayama Prefecture, Japan, in a small central California town called Madera. Her dad was on the board of the local Buddhist community, and they lived like many Japanese Americans did in the agricultural sector on a farm. But what she would share with me in dribs and drabs over the course of me delivering sections of the translated diary was a story about how Japanese American Buddhist families like hers dealt with what unfolded during World War II. She told me that she came home from school one day to see at the farmhouse door her father being beaten by some men in suits. And as she peered inside to the kitchen table, she saw her mother sitting at the kitchen table very, very still because somebody had a shotgun pointed to her mom's head. And in that moment, although she was only 11 years old, she knew that she needed to intervene. She knew that her parents from Wakayama Prefecture didn't speak very much English, and that those men in suits didn't speak very much Japanese. And so, as the most bilingual amongst them, even though she was very young, she tried to talk to everybody and find out what was unfolding. It turned out that her dad had been in the lettuce fields with a shotgun because he wanted to scare off some rabbits that were in the lettuce fields. But it was unfortunately at that moment when some men in suits, FBI special agents, came onto their farmhouse property. They thought they were potentially under some kind of threat, and so that's why they had tackled him and were beating him and had put a gun to her mother's head. After things were cleared up a little bit and her parents also understood that these were in fact government agents, they began to talk about his involvement in the local Buddhist temple or community. After a while, they said that he was on some kind of government list of people that they needed to interrogate and put under some surveillance, but that they would come back on another occasion. And in fact, they would, all the further investigating whether her father's involvement in the Buddhist community was cause for concern, a threat to national security. In the meantime, my professor's wife's dad said, look, we need to show these people that just because we're Buddhist doesn't mean that we're somehow anti-American or we're going to be engaged in espionage or sabotage or something. We need to somehow demonstrate our belonging and our loyalty to America, especially since their daughter had been born in California and was an American citizen. So one day, Mrs. Nagatomi was asked by her dad to turn on the wood-fired stove at the family bath. It was one of her chores and she didn't think much of it until he came down with everything in the farmhouse that had kanji or Japanese characters on them. Anything that had made in Japan, he started throwing them into the fire at the bathtub. For her as an 11-year-old girl, probably the worst thing was when he collected her precious Hinamatsuri Ningyo, the Girls' Day dolls that she had received recently, and threw those into the fire as well. All in a show of trying to prove to the outside world that they were not a threat, not a danger to American society. He had one last set of documents in his hand that he was going to throw in the fire, but he just couldn't get himself to do so. He hesitated. And the daughter, the 11-year-old, asked him, you know, what could be so important, more important than her dolls? And he said that as the board member who held all of the documents of the local Buddhist association from its founding all the way up to December 1941, he held in his hands this Buddhist community's history and didn't feel like they were his personal property that he could just burn into the fire. And the other thing he held in his hands was a bound sutra, a Buddhist scripture that had been handed down from his grandparents' generation to him. And he didn't feel that he could put that sacred scripture and burn it in the fire. And so he asked his wife to find one of those senbei bako, like a rice cracker tin box, some kimono to try to wrap these precious documents in. And then he took this now wrapped, protected sutra and this Buddhist Association's history and buried them right near the garage underneath a large tree so that he could find it when the time was right. Like many families, that family moved out to an assembly center, the Fresno Assembly Center, and fast forward, when they returned after the war, they had to sell their farm for 1/20th of its market value. And when they came back, the new owners demanded that they pay the market rate. And they hadn't made, a lot of money or anything during the war, so they couldn't afford that. They couldn't afford to retrieve their property, their farm. And the end of this story that Mrs. Nagatomi told me was that her dad tried really hard to find that box, to find the box with the Buddhist scripture, the teachings, and then this community's history, the temple history. But during the war, the new owners had torn down the garage and cut down all the large trees. So even though he roughly knew where it was, the kind of X marks the spot had disappeared, and dig as he might, he never found that box. So somewhere in the soil of California are Buddhist teachings and a Japanese American Buddhist community's history buried. The other main takeaway for me when Mrs. Nagatomi told me this story was that this was one family that in their effort to belong, in their effort to demonstrate that they weren't a threat to America, they symbolically burned away their Japaneseness. They were willing to do that because they felt pressured to do so. But what they weren't willing to burn away was their Buddhist faith. That they somehow felt needed to be a part of what would make them Japanese American. I start with this story because this has been also my story, a story of how to belong, how to find a place in America as an immigrant from Japan. In the Buddhist tradition, we have a word called goen. It's used in the vernacular Japanese to simply mean something where you either have some kind of connection to a person, a place, or a thing. You would say, 縁がありましたね, or ご縁がなかったですね. Like, you may have some kind of like connection. It's something a little bit like a mysterious karmic connection that you might have to something. And in that moment when I came across my professor's father's diary from Manzanar, I've been feeling this mysterious karmic connection to a group called Japanese Americans. And it was at that time that I began to conceive of writing a book that would tell my professor's father's story, the Buddhist priest, what he did at Manzanar, and what I translated there from the diary, but also capture the stories of Mrs. Nagatomi, that 11-year-old in Madera, California, and her family's experience. Over time, as I translated that diary for the family, I guess word got around to other Buddhist priests' families who approached me and said, we have our father or grandfather or uncle's diaries from when he was in camp. Could you translate it for us? And just as a form of respect, and also because I was curious and wanted to learn more about Japanese American history, about Buddhism in America, I started translating a lot of these diaries. I also started interviewing people. Ultimately, I think I interviewed over 100 camp survivors, Buddhist priests, their wives, their descendants. I interviewed veterans from those who served in the Pacific, in Europe. And I ended up writing a book called American Sutra, A Story of Faith and Freedom in the Second World War, that came out about a little over a year ago, I should say. It came out on Day of Remembrance 2019. And the fundamental question that drives this book, that's based on all these interviews and based on all these translations of Buddhist priests' diaries and memoirs and so forth, is this basic question of who counts as an American? Who belongs in this country? And I want to go back and talk about how that question became vivid to me. It had been a question that I already knew of when I first arrived in Portland, Oregon, when I was 17 years old, to attend college. I went to a small liberal arts school there called Reed College, and one of the things I kind of came to love right away living in Portland, especially in that era, was I became to be a huge fan of the NBA basketball team called the Portland Trail Blazers. And it wasn't just the Trail Blazers, but my friends who were over at another college called Lewis and Clark College. There was everything in Portland evoked this idea about trailblazers, about people making that journey west, a story about how America began in England and how that traveled westward across the Atlantic and formed New England, how York became New York, and how these people who traveled westward were somehow involved in a bigger story, a story of manifest destiny, a nation that believed that it was transmitting culture and civilization and religion, namely Christianity, into a territory that was presumed not to have civilization and religion. When a few years after my PhD, I ended up at a job at UC Berkeley, a place that I served as a Center for Japanese Studies director, and I held a Buddhist Studies professorship there. I would come to learn again about this story of America as a westward expanding nation in the name Berkeley itself. When the university and the town after which it was named was first being founded, apparently the trustees remembered a poem called America, written by a British philosopher, an Anglican bishop, and a poet called George Berkeley in the British, Berkeley in the American pronunciation. And one of the lines that they remembered as they were standing where the campus is today, looking past the Pacific Ocean through the Golden Gate, looking, in other words, westward, they remembered a poem in which he said, "Westward, the course of empire takes its way." So that's one story of America, an America that is essentially a white European nation that is founded on Christianity. But then over the years, I've been thinking about families like the Nagatomis and his wife's family, the Kimura family in Madera, California, how they came over to the United States and how none of this makes any sense. Their journey was never westward. Their pilgrimage, their crossing of the Pacific was an eastward journey. And one of the poems that I found as an interesting counterpoint to what George Berkeley said was a poem written by a Buddhist priest back in the period of the World War II incarceration. He wrote a poem called Leaving Santa Anita in 1942, in which he says, "This morning, the winding train like a big black snake takes us as far as Wyoming. The current of Buddhist thought always runs eastward. This policy may support the tendency of the teaching. Who knows?" Now, when he uses this word or phrase, the current of Buddhist thought always runs eastward, he's referring to a set of 4 Japanese characters, Bukkyo Tozen, literally Bukkyo, Buddhism, Tozen. To means eastward, and Zen means to advance. And it comes from a classical text or series of texts that talk about how when the Buddha, this is back in about 2,500 years ago by legend, the Buddha was about to die. He gave a prophecy that after his death, although he would not be there to teach anymore, what would remain was the Dharma, his teachings, and that his teachings would travel ever eastward. And from traveling ever eastward, it would spread to the 10 directions, meaning every direction. And back when Buddhism first entered Japan through China, Korea, and eventually the easternmost part of the Asian continent on these islands called Japan, back in the early texts, like the Nihon Shoki, the Nihon Ryoiki, some of these early chronicles use these words, Bukkyo Tozen, to refer to the fact that Buddhism had moved eastward, thus fulfilling the prophecy of the Buddha. And what I found really interesting about Reverend Nyogen Senzaki's poem was that he refers to this policy, meaning the US Army's policy of forcibly removing over 110,000 persons from the Pacific coast and sending them to these camps in the interior, in places like Wyoming, further east, and that perhaps this policy was actually fulfilling the Buddha's prophecy that the teachings would move eastward. Now, in the course of writing American Sutra, it wasn't just poems like Nyogen Senzaki's that I found just eye-opening and new. I try to read every book, every dissertation, every major article in the Japanese American history and World War II history area. But I found that often voices like Nyogen Senzaki, the stories of people like Reverend Nagatomi and the Kimura family, the Buddhist part of the story was missing. And so I started to do a lot of research on that particular aspect of the World War II experience. And so, for example, one of the most interesting things I learned about Pearl Harbor and its immediate aftermath was that even before that mass incarceration of people on the West Coast, community leaders, the Issei or the Japanese nationals who held prominent positions in the community, both in Honolulu and other parts of the Hawaiian Islands, as well as on the continental United States, began to be picked up right after the attack. And I would come to learn that Buddhist priests were rounded up in very large numbers. Hundreds of Buddhist priests were rounded up right away after the Pearl Harbor attack, unlike their Christian counterparts. And I would also learn that the very first person picked up, even before the smoke had cleared at Pearl Harbor, at 3 p.m. on December 7th, 1941, Bishop Gikyo Kuchiba, the head of the Hoppa Honganji Buddhist Temple in Honolulu, the largest Buddhist temple in Honolulu, he was picked up at 3 p.m., 30 minutes before martial law had even been announced. In this slide, you see Reverend Horyu Asaeda of the Liliha Shingonji Mission, as he gets picked up, taken to the Honolulu immigration station and fingerprinted. People like him and Bishop Kuchiba ended up either in a newly built camp that the internees themselves built initially as tents, as you can see on the upper right side of this slide, on a small island in Honolulu Harbor called Sand Island, or a little bit further inland in a gulch, a place called Honouliuli. And they would end up in these camps on the Hawaiian Islands before most of them were transferred to the mainland using 10 different ships, transferred further eastward as part of their World War II internment experience. So that was the first surprising thing, was that Buddhist priests were the first people picked up by the FBI. And I wanted to know why that was. Here is the enemy alien file and warrant of arrest of another Buddhist priest from Hawaii, Reverend Buntetsu Miyamoto, who had served at the Haleiwa Jodoshu Kaikyodo or temple. And he was picked up again right on the 7th of December 1941. That's what you can see on the warrant of arrest. And in his FBI case file, it's noted that he's been placed in something called Group A, individuals believed to be the most dangerous, who in all probability should be interned in event of war. What this document gives us a hint to is that you can see it in the language of in event of war. Prior to Pearl Harbor, the FBI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, Army G2, all of these intelligence agencies, military and civilian, had worked together to form lists of people divided by their relative degree of threat to national security, A, B, and C. And Buddhist priests, as a category of person, was considered to be a dangerous, a threat to American national security. Although not every Buddhist priest was arrested in this fashion, a vast majority of them, 80% of them, were picked up right away after the Pearl Harbor attack. And where did that sense come from, that Buddhism was somehow dangerous? To answer that question, I had to study Asian American history and go back even further than when the first Japanese Americans even came to America. I had to learn something about the Chinese Americans who, even before the Japanese came to America, made that journey eastward, had set up the first Buddhist temples in 1852 and onward, and how in the American imagination of the 19th century, bleeding into the first half of the 20th century, how an image of Buddhism as somehow, if not just un-American, was anti-American, was formed. Now with the Chinese, what we know is that in the middle of their journey to America, through Hawaii into California, working in the mines, on the railroads, all of these calls for exclusion, about stopping immigration happened. And of course, we know about the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act that was the first federal immigration law that targeted a particular religion or race or a particular group of people for exclusion from the United States. But in the lead up to that was a lot of discussion about, and they use this slur word, the heathen Chinese, meaning a group of people who were deemed unassimilable racially, but also religiously heathen or pagan. A group of people seen as somehow unable to assimilate religiously into the American landscape. And so calls for border walls. You see this 1870 Harper's Weekly illustration talking about a Chinese wall around the United States of America. Talk about a yellow peril or a Chinese invasion, a migrant invasion that would establish a heathen Chinese despotism in San Francisco. You see this pamphlet from 1873. This kind of thing was at the backdrop of how the Japanese would come to be understood, and how, in the case of the Japanese, especially in Hawaii, where by World War II, they represented the largest immigrant group, and thereby seen as posing an existential threat to the idea of America as a white Christian nation. That was when a lot of this discussion was held about the Japanese Americans and their association with Buddhism as being a threat to not only identity, but actual American national security. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can see from this slide how this association starts quite early. For as far back as the 1918, around World War I, where Japanese language schools and the government and Buddhists were often considered as a set to be some kind of threat to America. How discussions were held about the re-paganization of the Hawaiian Islands. They use that word, re-paganization, because Native Hawaiians had been converted to Christianity and thereby so-called made American. The fact of the existence of Japanese American Buddhists, a community that was about 80% Buddhist at the time of World War II, that for them, the authorities, was a existential threat in and of itself. And so that's one of the reasons and one of the interesting things I tried to learn about in the writing of the book American Sutra. And this is just an illustration of how that comes into sharp relief. Just, magazine illustrations. One from 1895 on the right side, again, Harper's Weekly, an illustration titled The Yellow Peril. You see on one side, a group of people living under the light that emanates from the Christian cross. And over in the distance, this peril, the yellow peril, approaching this land, a dark, cloudy approach with a Buddha at its center. That image was replicated during World War II in an article in a magazine called Free World Magazine called Buddhism as a Japanese Propaganda Instrument. And what you see is a military tank upon which you find the fusion of a Japanese, kind of looks like a kabuki actor, but I suppose they were intending to illustrate like a samurai warrior fused with the Kamakura Buddha statue coming to attack America. So that's why Buddhists were considered in that period as somehow a threat to America. And because so many Japanese Americans were Buddhist, the whole community tended to be seen in that light. But of course, it didn't matter if you were Buddhist or Christian, whether you were a of the age that you could take up arms, or if you were an infirm grandmother or a little baby. What happened after that selective internment and the rounding up of community leaders was the issuance in February 19th, 1942 of Executive Order 9066, an order that gave the US Army the ability to determine whoever they deemed was a threat to national security to be removed from various kinds of defense command zones. And in the case of the Pacific Coast, the Western Defense Command Zone, over which Lieutenant General John DeWitt oversaw, made a determination that everyone of Japanese ancestry were to be removed from that zone. If you read the executive order that the president issued, it actually says nothing about, there's no word Japanese Americans or even the word Japanese. It just says, it just gives discretion to the Army to pick whoever they want. And so when they do, the signs go up that says instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. In other words, the Army made a determination that even though the United States was also at war with fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, the only mass incarceration and forced removal was going to be for those of Japanese ancestry. DeWitt's main lieutenant, Colonel Carl Bendiston, as an architect of this forced removal and mass incarceration, was in the process of it asked by somebody overseeing one of the orphanages in Los Angeles if the little kids there, the babies, the young children, including mixed-raced babies and children, if they would need to be moved to some camp, if they were subject to Executive Order 9066. And he said, if, and this is a quote from him, not my words, if they have a single drop of Japanese blood in them, I want them in camp. And so that's how totalistic this ethnic cleansing of the West Coast was. Everyone, if you had a drop of Japanese blood, even if you're a mixed race baby in an orphanage, you were going to go to one of these camps. Now with this group, the virtual Tadaima pilgrimage, I don't need to rehearse all of the details about what happens in that process, but I wanted to point out a few things that you may be less familiar with, that Buddhist part of the story. Now, on the left of this slide, you see a fairly large gathering of people ready to board some buses right in front of the Nishihonganji, the old Nishihonganji temple in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. It's the location of where the Japanese American National Museum is today. But people would assemble to these locations, 108 of them, so-called civil control stations, where you were supposed to report by 12 noon of a certain date to be taken to some temporary, euphemistically called assembly center, as the long-term camps were being built. And as people so-called left home, in Buddhism we have this word shukke, to leave home literally, but it means to go on some kind of spiritual journey, to enter into a spiritual path. And often it means, we use it to refer to those who become ordained as Buddhist priests, monks and nuns. But it really means to go on a journey, to leave home on a pilgrimage. And so temples closed down, businesses closed down. People had between a week and 10 days to sell their farms like the Kimura family did in Madera, California for 1/20th of its market value. And they were taken on these buses and trains to these assembly centers. And that's where they encountered, once again, what I would call Anglo-Protestant normativity. assembly centers like this one in Puyallup, Washington State, about 30 miles south of Seattle. They were county fairgrounds, Tanforan, Santa Anita. These were horse racing tracks, and so therefore people's new homes were in these horse stables where the smell of manure and urine still lingered even if new wood was put down on the floor. So people were suddenly dislocated, suddenly placed in these very unhygienic places, and they tried to make the best of that situation. One of the things I found out in my research about assembly centers was that, when you go into some kind of confinement site, a prison, for instance, they check your luggage for any contraband. And soon after Japanese Americans began to arrive at the assembly centers, they were told that anything that had kanji or Japanese characters on them in a bound book, for example, a Buddhist sutra, or even like a book of Japanese poetry, would be considered contraband. You'd think like maybe they would say guns and maybe cameras because of espionage, but why did they target, Japanese books? It, I think, has something to do, again, with this idea of Anglo-Protestant normativity, because the two exceptions that the government gave for a bound book with Japanese kanji in it was, one, a Japanese English language dictionary, and two, a Japanese language Christian Bible. In other words, what they let slide, what they allowed in, what they said was okay, was if you had the need to learn English and you needed a dictionary to do so, that was acceptable. And if you had not yet become Christian, or if you already were a Christian and needed a Japanese language Bible to continue that faith, that was acceptable. And so I call it Anglo-Protestant normativity, Anglo both in the sense of whiteness, but also the sense of English only, and Protestantism in terms of the general culture of that time as to what constituted an American who belonged, an American who would be, in some sense, if not already built up amongst the Japanese Americans in the course of their own incarceration. Of course, not every family accepted this premise that to be American was to be English-speaking and Christian. This family in the Portland Assembly Center, the family quarters you see in this photo is of Reverend Tansai Terakawa of the Oregon Buddhist Church, his daughter Hiroko playing checkers with her friend Lillian Hayashi. You can see how they took their quarters, try to make it as livable as possible, try to have some sense of normalcy and decency. And the other thing you might notice is that they rejected that Anglo-Protestant normativity. On their wall, looming large, was an American flag and a photo of the Buddha. For this American family, they believed that you could be both Buddhist and American at the same time. Because of disorientation, dislocation, loss, it isn't surprising that in moments like this, people turn to their faith. And so even starting in the assembly centers, even though people resided there only through spring, summer, and early fall of 1942, quickly Buddhist groups began forming in these assembly centers to do what in this slide they called Buddhist work, to help each other, rely on their faith, use their faith to come together, to give them some direction when everything had become so disoriented. Give them some sense of home and belonging when they've been dislocated as they had been by the forced removal. And once they got to the WRA, or the War Relocation Authority camps, they began to form that kind of community as well in barracks, what are sometimes called the barrack churches. The one on the right from Poston, the one on the left, in the Japanese you can read it, Manzana Bukkyokai, the Manzanar Buddhist Church. You see Reverend Nagatomi sitting there with glasses in the front row. So that's how people came together to somehow resist or somehow say, we belong here too. One of the first things I began translating in Reverend Shinjo Nagatomi's diaries was the fact that he participated in the Buddha's birthday, called Hanamatsuri in Japanese, as soon as he got to when he got to Manzanar, and that he also participated in many, or not just participated, he officiated many funerals and memorial services of people who died in that first winter and spring of 42, 43. And so as I was reading those things, I realized there was a word that captured that in the Buddhist tradition. Now, if you look at the kanji character on this screen, it's sometimes read butsu, meaning the Buddha, and also can be read hotoke, which also means the Buddha, but can also refer to the recent dead. So when somebody dies and their corpse is lying in wake, we, out of respect, in Japanese, use the word hotoke to refer to the corpse, meaning somehow in the Japanese mind, those who have just died are kind of like a Buddha, to be appreciated, venerated, and reflected on. And so in the course of my research, I found Reverend Nagatomi's participation in Hanamatsuri, or the Buddha's birthday, the rebirth, as it were, of Buddhism in the camps. You can see him on the right-hand photo in that slide where he's giving a talk about the rebirth of Buddhism, the birth of the Buddha. And behind him, you see what's called a hanamido, or a flower shrine. It comes from the legend of the Buddha's birth, that when the Buddha was born, the heavens were so pleased that it rained sweet rain and flowers. And in the Japanese tradition, whenever you celebrate the Buddha's birthday, and you can see it with the woman in kimono on the left, she's going up and pouring sweet tea on a little statue of the baby Buddha inside of this flower shrine. And everyone in the congregation goes up and pours a little bit of that sweet tea to represent the sweet rain that fell on the Buddha in legend. In one of the camps that I studied, they didn't have this kind of beautiful, ornate shrine, or they didn't have a little statue of a Buddha. And one of the most moving stories I came across was of a young YBA, or Young Buddhist Association member, Arthur Yamabe, in Bismarck, Fort Lincoln, celebrating Hanamatsuri, where he goes to the mess hall and finds the largest carrot that he can find and carves a baby Buddha statue, or some semblance of one, for the Hanamatsuri they needed to celebrate in 1942 April. One of the priests that oversaw that ceremony of trying to maintain their Buddhist faith behind barbed wire, surrounded by armed guards, was to take what they could find to make that ceremony meaningful. And he carved, and once Arthur had carved the carrot Buddha, because they didn't have sweet tea to pour over, what they did was they pooled their army ration sugar and found some coffee and made a mixture of sweet coffee that they poured over the carrot Buddha. So that's how people in camp managed to sustain their faith, draw on their faith, celebrate their faith. And as I mentioned, Reverend Naratomi talked about the recent dead, the other Buddhas, the Buddhas as ancestors, those who have come before us. In the middle slide in this, or photo in this slide, you can see Reverend Nagatomi in his full robes officiating a funeral that had just taken place. And at the Manzanar Buddhist church, they had a little columbarium where the cremated ashes could be honored, remembered. I think he didn't want there to be a situation where these lives lost would just be forgotten. He wanted to find some way to console the families. They had just lost everything they worked so hard for before coming to camp, and now they had lost a loved one. And in that moment of loss, he wanted to give some words of reassurance, some ritual that would give some structure, meaning, and sensibility to what these families were undergoing. And by the time Obon of 1943 came around, Reverend Nagatomi was participating in a revival of Buddhism. People were no longer afraid of being told that you have to be English-speaking and Christian faith to be American. They began to come out in larger and larger numbers to the barrack churches. And by the time summer of 1943 came around, Buddhists in the camps began to assemble for what they traditionally have in the Japanese American communities in the pre-war West Coast and in Hawaii, this idea of coming together for Obon. It's a Buddhist ceremony and festival to celebrate the return of the ancestors. They go away for a while, but they return momentarily during the summer. And people would greet their ancestors with food, with music, with odori or dance. And in the case of Manzanar, which is what the slide you see on the right-hand side here, in the Japanese it reads, Manzanar Bukkyokai Bon Odori, the Bon dance at Manzanar, 1943, August the 15th. According to government records kept internally, nearly over 4,000 people in the camp turned up for this. And in the other photos you see, upper left, Heart Mountain, lower left, Amache, Colorado. People in every camp came out in summer of 1943 to participate in this communal act of belonging, of sharing not just with each other, but with their ancestors. In these camps, one of the most important Buddhist lessons or Buddhist teachings that help people to adapt to their situation is a teaching called Hoben. It comes from the Sanskrit word upaya, that the Buddha, when he was alive, would adapt kind of skillfully his teachings to whoever was in front of him. The Buddha was sometimes called the great physician. And as a pharmacist would know what kind of medicine to give to each person based on their condition. And realizing that not everybody needed the same medicine, but some people needed certain medicines to heal themselves, other people needed a certain dosage, other people more or less, to skillfully adapt the teachings to meet the person, to meet the moment. Hoben, skillful adaptation. in the course of my research, another memoir that comes to mind is this one. It's called Amerika Kaikyo, Showa no Mikyo Tozen. Again, using that word Tozen, that eastward transmission, in this case of esoteric Buddhism. Esoteric Buddhism meaning the form of Buddhism denominationally known as Shingon Buddhism. And its headquarters in Little Tokyo, Los Angeles, at the Koyasan Buddhist Temple. Reverend Takahashi Setsu wrote this memoir after the war, reflecting on all he went through during the war. And he talks about how he first was very annoyed by the armed guards checking up on all the internees every time they needed to go to the toilets, the searchlights that went through even in the course of the night. And he talked about eventually not only coming to be able to get used to those searchlights, but actually using them for religious practice. In one line from his memoir, he writes, "I return to the quiet and supreme life of walking alongside Kobo Daishi," that's his sect's founder, "as if trying to practice meditation under the moonlit pine. I have been viewing the guards' searchlights as the Buddha's sacred light and have been practicing Komyo meditation together with Kobo Daishi." In his tradition of Shingon Buddhism, they often have these meditations and visualizations where the moon representing the enlightenment, the awakened light of the Buddha, to infuse one's mind and consciousness with that moon. In this case, using the searchlights in the camp to suffuse his mind, to allow him to actually practice Buddhism better. Another really moving story of how people used whatever was there in their life, their karmic circumstances, to try to practice their faith and persist in their identity as a Japanese American Buddhist, is the story of these altars, sometimes called shumidan or sometimes butsudan. These altars made by two brothers, the Nishiura brothers in Heart Mountain. Before the war, the Nishiura brothers had been quite well known as master carpenters, craftsmen in traditional Japanese architecture, temple and shrine building. They'd in fact built the San Jose Buddhist Temple. And for the people in Heart Mountain, it was amazing to have these two very talented individuals there, because they would make beautiful altars so that the community could practice their faith out of whatever scrap wood they could find. Sometimes it was desert wood, sometimes it was leftover lumber, sometimes it was pieces from the mess hall of crates that had been the containers in which vegetables or fruit had come into the camp. They would take any scrap piece of wood and somehow transform it into this beautiful altar. Here you can see at their Hanamatsuri, their Buddha's birthday, a little hanamido or shrine on the left, and in the center, one of these beautiful Nishiura brother altars. The brothers ended up making quite a few of these altars, and they ended up in different places after the war. One went to Gilroy, California, to the Buddhist temple there. And eventually when that temple closed, that altar got donated to the Japanese American National Museum. Still today, there's one of these Nishiura brother altars at the Buddhist temple of Chicago, brought there by those Japanese Americans who resettled in Chicago. There's also one that happened to have gone to Japan. It's a little bit unique among the Nishiura brother altars in that it depicts this very important Buddhist teaching, this image called the renge, or the lotus flower. This Nishiro brother created altar from Heart Mountain, ended up in a temple in Japan called Joonji. And it's a beautiful altar, and it's as you can see, currently even maintained. And if you look at the details of how the paneling was put together, you see these images. You see an image of a desert landscape with birds flying in the air, with desert succulents on the ground. You see a guard tower and a fence. You see on the left, you see on the left a lotus flower carved in some kind of pond where some of the leaves are there, and then this lotus flower is blooming. Now, I mentioned this because this was one of the most important lessons from the World War II camps for Buddhists. This idea, an image of the lotus flower blossoming above muddy water. One of my friends, when he read American Sutra, he's the abbot of one of the temples in Little Tokyo called Zenshuji, Reverend Shumyo Kojima. He drew this image for me as what he took away from the book as the main teaching or the main lesson that Japanese American Buddhists learned during World War II. It again evokes this image of the lotus flower emerging from the muddy waters. But in this case, the image is recalling the fact that the lotus flower represents the Buddha's mind. The muddy waters is supposed to represent the world of suffering, of dis-ease and pain. And that this lotus flower is rising up above it. In this case, you see the pond being depicted as if it were North America. You see the barbed wires, and you see this flower rising up above it. But one of the big lessons among one of the other stories I came across in my research for the book was how one of the priests, the Jodoshu priest, Kubokawa Kyokujo, who was the bishop of the Jodo sect of Buddhism in Hawaii, how he got arrested right on Pearl Harbor Day, ended up in camp, and never had a chance to even go home and pick up any other clothes. So when the Buddha's birthday came around for him, he was still in the same robes, the same clothes as back in December of the previous year. And he gave a sermon using this image of the lotus flower blossoming above muddy water. What he talked about was his own robes, how muddy and dirty they were. And he said, you know, we usually think of how we want to transcend, rise up above this dusty world, this muddy waters. But let's think about this again. A lotus flower doesn't grow in pristine water, pure water. It actually needs the nutrients from the mud. And just so, these robes that are dirty, all of you who haven't had a change of clothes are in dirty clothes, but this is something that is going to feed us, nourish us to rise up above and become that lotus flower, that which is connected still, interlinked with everything that we are experiencing in this forced removal and incarceration. I want to move to kind of like the camp after effects, things related to how my book has evolved since its publication and how that teaching from that lesson from camp about being interlinked continues today. Many of you know that last year was the year when There's so much in the news about what was happening at the southern border, much like that Chinese wall they were talking about in the 19th century. They were talking about building a wall on the southern border to keep out a different group of migrants, asylum seekers seeking refuge from violence. And in that context, I think it was especially when talks were going on about families being separated as a form of policy, as a deterrence policy to stop this large group of migrants from coming into America. It was then that many camp survivors and their descendants talked about how hearing of family separation especially triggered in them the memory of camp, what happened to their families and their communities back in World War II. I have to admit, just like when I first started doing the research about, that diary 18 years ago, I didn't know that much about Japanese American history at that time, and I had to kind of learn about it and educate myself. And when I first started hearing about Japanese Americans who were protesting what was happening at the border, at the inhumane conditions, the unhygienic conditions of ICE detention facilities, I have to admit, I also was quite ignorant and didn't know that much about it. And I had heard about a group that went to Texas. One of my colleagues and friends, Reverend Ron Kobata from the Buddhist Church of San Francisco, was one of the participants. They had gone to a place called Dilley, Texas, to the South Texas Residential Family Center, and to the nearby former World War II internment camp called Crystal City, a family reunification camp, ironically. And this place that physically was located close by, that held the largest numbers, over 2,700 children who had been separated from their families, and how they went on their pilgrimage to the former World War II Japanese American camp, and also went to protest at this place that represented for them this residence, this interlinking of what their families went through back in World War II and what was happening today. And that they would make paper cranes or tsuru to hang up on these fences of ICE detention facilities such as the one at Dilley, Texas. So I was hearing about these protests and the involvement of my friend, Reverend Kobata, in them. And I was trying to learn more about what all of these immigration policies meant and understand all the ways in which exclusion has had this long history of exclusion by either race or even by religion, with the more recent travel bans that have targeted those from majority Muslim nations. And really thinking about how they tend to intersect with what happened to Japanese Americans and also those who came before Japanese Americans. But it wasn't until a few weeks after this particular protest of various people that I happened to know in Texas that I received an email. Its subject line was Sutra Cranes. One of the people most intimately involved in this protest, Nancy Ukai, from the 50 Objects Project, and she's somebody I happen to know as the president of the Berkeley JCL, and she mentioned how she and Satsuki Ina and Mike Ishii from New York and Carl Takei, all these leaders in the Japanese American community had gone to this thing, and that she, Nancy, had made colored photocopies of the front of my book to make these origami paper cranes, and that she put up some of them as part of this protest. And she sent these photos titled Sutra Cranes. And that's when I kind of knew that, again, just like back then, when I first came across those diaries, I had some kind of mysterious karmic responsibility and obligation to involve myself, engage myself, educate myself about what was happening. And so when I first then learned that there was going to be another protest organized by this group called Tsuru for Solidarity in a place called Fort Sill, Oklahoma, that's when I decided to first join them to lend my support for what this organization was doing. Fort Sill was a place where I knew a lot about because of the research of the book, in the sense that it was a place where 90 Buddhist priests were incarcerated for the short months in the spring of 1942. It was one of those camps that were lesser known amongst the Japanese American World War II camps because it only operated for a few months. And it, in addition to leaders from the mainland Issei community, I mentioned 90 Buddhist priests, they included a group from Hawaii and also a group from Panama. There were about 300 Japanese Panamanians among the 700 some people of Japanese ancestry who were interned there. And I also knew about it because as I was translating some of the entries of Reverend Takahashi Seitsu, he's the one that I mentioned earlier about using those guards' searchlights for his meditation. He talked about participating in a funeral for a man named Kanesaburo Oshima, a man who came from Kona, Hawaii, whose granddaughter is somebody who's a colleague of mine, Reverend Jiko Nakade. She's the head of the Soto Zen Buddhist temple in Kona, Hawaii. This man, Kanesaburo Oshima, had been on the fence line, just worried sick about his family back home in Hawaii. He had left behind his wife and 11 children. He was a storekeeper. He just yearned to go back home, and he began just out of desperate, like, not, you know, he's in the middle of Oklahoma. He's not going to get back to Hawaii, but he just wanted to somehow get home. And as he was at that fence, he was shot in the back of the neck by armed sentries. And there was a funeral for him and two others, according to Reverend Takahashi's diary, that 90 Buddhist priests oversaw. And so I just felt this karmic connection to that place, Fort Sill, which was the proposed location for the movement of about 1,400 of those children from Texas and elsewhere who were unaccompanied minors, children separated from their families, to be put into a former World War II internment camp that had, before the World War II experience, been also the location where Geronimo had been incarcerated, where the Apache people had been herded into. And so it has this history of exclusion. And I thought, I have to join this small band of people making cranes, raising their voices about how this history is interlinked. And I was so privileged to be able to join this group there. And a few weeks later, I organized, or some months later, I organized a group of Buddhist priests to help support the efforts of this group, Tsuru for Solidarity, and went a second time. And in this circumstance, bringing together people in my circle of Buddhist clergy to show their concern as moral leaders about what's going on in these border facilities and ICE detention centers and proposed places where this policy is something that affected Japanese American Buddhists back then, and it's something that we can speak out against today. And so we marched together with Tsurufo Saudi, we marched together with Latinx Dreamers. We held a Buddhist service for people like Kanesaburo Oshima, who you can see in his picture sent by Reverend Nakade, my friend from Kona, Hawaii, along with lay, special lay, Maila lay that she sent from Hawaii, that we took to the fence where he was shot at Fort Sill, where we named him, we named the others who died there, who hadn't had a proper remembrance in all those years since World War II. We also invited those people with us, especially the Latinx Dreamers, the Native American elders, people from Black Lives Matter, to offer names from their communities of people who have also faced racialized violence, unjust deportation, family separation, and indefinite incarceration. And in that way, this was meaningful to me as an expression of how we are, in fact, interlinked as a community. And so it was that I agreed to do a Buddhist service for a gathering planned in June, on June 6, 2020 in Washington, D.C., where the plan was to take 125,000 cranes to represent all the people incarcerated of Japanese ancestry back in World War II, and place them not on the fence of a ICE detention facility, but on the fence of the White House to make that case about these interlinked histories. Now, as we all know, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, that had to be canceled. But since I had promised to do this ceremony, I had in my mind the idea that we Buddhist priests, along with other interfaith communities, that we would recite the names of every single person that those cranes represented. And I began a project last November to try to come up with a list of all of the names, because it turns out that there is no such unified list that accounts for Japanese persons of Japanese ancestry who were incarcerated during World War II in the various kinds of camps, the army camps, the Department of Justice camps, the temporary detention stations, the assembly centers, the War Relocation Authority camps. All of those camps put together held people of U.S. citizenship, Japanese nationality, Japanese Panamanians, Japanese Peruvians, and there was no unified list that could actually contain the names of all the 125,000 names. And so I began this project to do that ceremony. And even though I had learned that it was going to be canceled, I've been working on trying to make that list. Because there's something valuable about remembering names. There's something about the idea of remembrance itself. The word member meaning the body, embodiedness, and to remember them was to, in some sense, make real what this community's history was. So I began by asking my friends at Densho, my friends at Manzanar, my friends at all the kind of big WRA camp related organizations to see what kind of lists they may have. What did they do with the Form 26 lists of people? What have they done with the final accountability rosters of each of the WRA camps? What kind of lists do we have? Can we share them? And they very kindly responded positively. I also reached out to the Japanese Community and Cultural Center of Hawaii, the JCCH, that had created the Hawaii internee directly to account for the people in Sand Island and Honouliuli and all the people that went to the mainland camps as well. I contacted people like Russell Endo of the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition, who's been painstakingly making lists for that particular confinement site. I myself had been making lists of Buddhist priests, Shinto priests, and Christian ministers. It was this kind of nerdy little project I had to create the most accurate list of every single person that was a clergy person during World War II, which camps they went into, in which order, where did they serve before the war, where did they serve after the war. I found myself in conversation with other, list makers. And whether it was something created by the government or more often than not, I found for the non-war relocation authority camps, these army camps like Lordsburg or Department of Justice camps like Santa Fe or Crystal City, that I would need to match up whatever the government rosters were with what the internees themselves made. So these documents, Jinmeiroku, Jinmeibo, these kind of Japanese internee directories in which they wrote down the names of every person in camp. These became valuable sources to compile these lists, and to integrate and unify them became the goal. I became obsessed with not leaving anyone out. And I think that's because I remember what Reverend Nagatomi did back in World War II, that diary, where he talks about his writing those kanji characters, those three of them, I, Re, and To, on a monument built for that Obon of 1943. Ireto literally means a tower or monument, To. Ire, that honors the Re, the spirits of the ancestors, the spirits of those who have just died. He didn't want to leave anyone out in the Obon of 1943. He had conducted so many funerals and memorial services up until that point. And when they dedicated this monument, the day before that picture of 4,000 some people dancing in the Obon dance of 1943, Obon at Manzanar, when they dedicated this monument, he was thinking as a Buddhist priest, but he knew that the community included Christians and people who identify with the Shinto tradition. And so he tried to make it an interfaith gathering in which he opened the ceremony with a Protestant minister as well. He acknowledged the fact that the concrete was raised by families who donated 5 cents or 10 cents each per barrack. He acknowledged that YBA, the Young Buddhist Association of San Pedro, Terminal Island, that group had helped do the manual labor to actually build it, but the design of the monument was done by a Catholic architect, Ryozo Kado. That spirit of inclusion, that spirit of not leaving anyone out, is also what drives me to make sure I don't forget anybody in this list that I'm making. Don't forget people, for example, like Mrs. Nagatomi's family. They sold their farm in Madera, California for 1/20th of its market value and went to the Fresno Assembly Center. But they were one of the people that received a special dispensation to leave the Assembly Center to go and work in the sugar beet farms of Idaho, in Utah. And so they spent the rest of the war in the so-called free zone. And so they never entered a WRA camp, thereby never appearing in one of the government lists of the people who were residents of the WRA camps. I think of people like them, and I want to kind of think through all the people who might be missing from lists, people who committed suicide at the LA County Jail, people who were from Mexico but were deported after spending some days in the Tuna Canyon detention station, but never went to one of the other main Department of Justice camps, so don't appear on any lists like that. How do you account for people who were in the tuberculosis facilities, the sanitarium, where they were separated from their families and under guard in these facilities? How do you make sure you don't leave anybody out of whatever nationality, Japanese American, Japanese Canadian, Japanese nationals, Japanese Peruvians, Japanese Panamanians? How do you not leave anybody out? But anyone of Japanese ancestry who experienced incarceration, can we create a list like that? To me, that's one of the lessons of the Manzanar Ireto. I want to end with this idea about Nembutsu. I think anybody who has visited a Jodo Shinshu or Jodoshu temple in America know that when people talk about Nembutsu, they are talking about reciting the name of the Buddha, remembering and recalling the Buddha's name by saying Namamida Butsu. But originally, the word Nembutsu comes from the Sanskrit word Buddha Anusmrti, the idea that the absent Buddha is remembered, made real again, given a body again, by recalling the name, by recalling the Buddha's name, we make the Buddha present. And I've been thinking about this word because of this list to capture all the names of everybody that experienced incarceration, experienced deportation, experienced family separation back in World War II. How do we remember and recall them? That June 6th ceremony in Washington, D.C. that couldn't happen because of the pandemic, we ended up doing a version of that ceremony as a virtual event called Tsuru Rising. And most of the program featured all these wonderful Japanese American community leaders who spoke just elegantly about the connection between what happened back then and what's happening now. How people didn't stand up for Japanese Americans in large numbers, didn't protest at what was happening to Japanese Americans back then. But today, because of that experience, the Japanese American community would rise up, would allow those cranes to fly, despite the fact that we couldn't go to Washington, D.C. And I had the privilege of organizing a ceremony in Little Tokyo, together with my colleagues at several of the different denominations in the Little Tokyo Buddhist clergy community. And we gathered at the Higashi Honganji Temple, where we dedicated cranes. As we recited sutras, we also dedicated and recited any merit that came from our recitation to names not just from World War II, but names that interlinked to many different kinds of communities that have been experiencing racialized violence, incarceration, deportation, family separation. Amongst the memorial tablets we made for this occasion, we see someone like Kino Jungo, who experienced in the moment after the Pearl Harbor attack, vigilante violence in the city of Stockton, California. I paired him with Bowie Chung, a Burmese American man in Midland, Texas, who was stabbed at a Sam's Club because of anti-Asian COVID-19 racism. I talked about Kanesaburo Oshima, shot in the back of the neck at that fence line, leaving behind those 11 children and his wife in Kona, Hawaii. and we mention the name of George Floyd, murdered with a policeman's knee on the back of his neck for over 8 minutes. These are the interlinked histories that I feel I've inherited. I started today's talk with the idea that this has been a pilgrimage for me to become a Japanese American. And as it happens, this year was the year I decided to take on the naturalization oath. I had been approved for naturalization. I put in the papers, passed the biometric background checks, passed the civics test, passed the English test last year in 2019. And this year was going to be the year that I would naturalize, become a US citizen. But because of the pandemic, the original date in March was postponed to June the 19th. And there's something to me, the Goen, the mysterious karmic condition that postponement had, that made me think about another form of interconnectedness. So you see me in this photo on the left with my new naturalization certificate the day I became a US citizen. But closely thereafter, I also participated in a march, a silent one, because it was organized by Buddhist monastics associated with a Buddhist seminary in Rosemead, California, of Korean, Vietnamese, and Chinese Buddhist monastics who organized a Buddhists for Black Lives Matter march. Because it was organized by Buddhist priests, it was to be a silent march, no slogans, just silent walking meditation to City Hall, called the Great Awakening Walk. They invoked the history of people like Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist master who was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in the middle of the Vietnam War by Martin Luther King. They invoked people like Frederick Douglass, who supported Chinese Americans who were about to be excluded by the Exclusion Act in a speech in Boston a few days after the first Juneteenth, June 19th. A few years afterwards, Frederick Douglass gave this amazing lecture about the legacy of slavery, about how the United States was built by chattel slavery, how its wealth was formed on the backs of slaves, which is what made it attractive for immigrants to come. But that his vision of America was one that was not a white Christian one, but a multi-ethnic and religiously free one. And I also invoke today a man named Ray Loggins, an African-American businessman who ran a catering company for Hollywood studios in Los Angeles during World War II. When Japanese Americans returned to the West Coast after the camps closed, they often faced discrimination in employment and in housing. Many white employers wouldn't hire them, many white landowners wouldn't rent to them. And so Buddhist temples became a place of refuge. Some historic Japanese American Christian churches, the same thing, a place of refuge, sanctuary. They ran these hostels so that people could have a place to stay while they try to find housing and work. And Mr. Ray Loggins became a friend. He did the catering events in Hollywood, and leftover food he would bring to the Buddhist temple. He even employed members of the temple, gave them part-time work in his company because nobody else would hire them. So when I think about having become an American on that auspicious day, Juneteenth, 2020, I think about Frederick Douglass. I think about Black Lives Matter. I think about people like Ray Loggins, who stepped up and helped out their neighbor. And think about the fact that I join this line of ancestors. This line of ancestors becoming American, joining those who have come before us, is not something that I take lightly or something that I feel is an easy thing, because I think those of us who are new Americans inherit the karma of that which has gone before. As a new Japanese American, I inherit everything that happened to all of these Japanese American families back in World War II. And as an American, I inherit everything from the ideas of freedom, due process, equality under the law, but also the imperfections of America. And that this is in fact a process, that America is not a stuck thing, but a nation of becoming. And that it's not a perfect process, but one that I'm inspired to join because of people like Nyogen Senzaki. This is a poem he wrote towards the end of the war. That same Buddhist priest from Los Angeles who talked about going on that train to Wyoming, to Heart Mountain, how he would take the Buddhist teachings ever eastward, how he thought that policy of incarceration would actually manifest something new in community. He wrote at the end of the war this poem called Land of Liberty. Land of liberty, people of independence. The Constitution is beautiful. It blooms like the spring flower. It is the scripture by itself. No foreign book can surpass it. Like the baby Buddha, each of the people should point to the heaven and earth and say, America is a country of righteousness. What a sentiment from somebody who is experiencing what he did in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. It reminds me of the founder of his tradition, Bodhidharma, or Dharma Daishi in Japanese, who is often said to have practiced meditation so intently that his legs fell off. And in Japan, we have these Dharma dolls, these little dolls that are kind of like, they've got the legs cut off, but they've got the face of this Buddhist priest. And when you kind of push it, this little doll, this round doll, it always comes back up straight because it's weighted in such a way that it always kind of tips up straight. And in the Japanese Buddhist tradition, we have this saying associated with this Buddhist teacher, Nana korobi yaoki, 7 times down, 8 times get up. That sentiment must have infused Reverend Nyogen Senzaki's mind, that our practice as Buddhists, our practice as Americans, is not about perfection. Sometimes when we try to meditate, our mind wanders, falls off the path. It's not about perfection, but about the idea that when one's mind wanders off somewhere, it's okay, that's natural, but bring it back straight again. When we fall down 7 times, we should get back up 8 times. When we fall down 1,000,000 times, let's get up 1,000,001 times. Juneteenth 2020 was the day I became a Japanese American.